World of Warcraft has hundreds of raid bosses over the years, some of them legendary, and some, well, not so much. While we all remember the Arthuses, Illidan's, and Garroshes of the world, there are plenty of bosses that just kind of exist, forgotten in the depths of old raid tiers, never to be mentioned again, unless you're a lore nerd or really into farming transmog. Starting off our list at number 10, we have Karoth, one of the many bosses from Antorus the Burning Throne that players probably have forgotten. By the time you reach Karoth, you've probably already battled through some of the Legion's most powerful demons, including the massive Fellhounds of Sargeras, the old Horde faction boss Varimathras, and even Eonar, the literal embodiment of life itself. So when you finally get to Karoth, you'd expect something epic, right? Instead, what you get is a Fel-infused assembly line operator. Yeah, this guy isn't a legendary demon general or an ancient god of destruction. He's basically a factory manager for the Legion's war machines. His entire purpose in the story was to build the big bad demons that we're about to fight throughout Antorus. Mechanically, Karoth wasn't bad. He actually had some interesting mechanics. The fight was split into two phases. In Phase 1, you'd be fighting Karoth himself, dodging his massive Ruiner ability. In Phase 2, he jumps away from the fight, activating his war machine forges, and starts building new adds. You know, because actually fighting isn't his thing. Now, credit where credit is due, this fight made for some slightly unique encounters where your raid had to split up and burn down the war machines before they came to life. If you failed, well, congrats, you just gave Karoth even more goons to throw at you. So if Karoth's mechanics weren't bad, why do we not talk about him? Simple, he was just completely overshadowed by everything else in Antorus. Think about it. This is the raid where you fight Agrimar, a literal titan, free Eonar, a literal titan, and Argus the Unmaker, another literal titan. And in the middle of all of that, we had a demon factory worker? Yeah, not exactly legendary material. Even lore-wise, Karoth was just another cog in the Legion's machines. He had no real backstory, no significant connections to the Titans, and no personal stakes in the war. He was just there because the Legion needed someone to keep their demon factories running. And let's be honest, how many people really care about the management side of an intergalactic war? At the end of the day, Karoth is the definition of a filler boss. He wasn't bad, but he was completely forgettable. And when you're standing next to world-ending Titans and cosmic horrors, the last thing you want to be remembered as is the dude who made the war machines. You're not going to believe what game I play. Back in January, I did my first sponsor for Raid, and I've been playing every day since. Just look at my roster of champions. Yes, this is my actual account, not one they gave me to show off. And honestly, part of the reason I like it so much is because it gives me a lot of World of Warcraft Raid vibes, since the boss fights are actually unique. Take the Fire Knight, for example. This boss has a massive shield that blocks all damage unless you hit him 5 times in one round. That means you have to build a comp with multi-hit skills, manage your cooldowns, and then burn him down before he strips away your buffs and heals himself. Or you can cheese the fight with turn meter reduction champs so he never actually gets to take a single turn after you break his shield. It's a puzzle to fight, and figuring it out feels great when you get it right, and he drops regeneration gear, which is needed if you want to solo boss fights later. Now, here's the deal. If you want to support the channel, downloading Raid and using my link in the description or scanning the QR code helps way more than even a Patreon donation. Why? Because if enough of you join, I can ask Raid for more deals and free shards. Plus, I really need help in clan bosses. My clan is called Heroes Cool Squad, and I'm trying to push harder stages of Hydra clan boss. Even if you already played, please join. I need all the help I can get. I'm all alone. And if you sign up under my link and everything, you'll get the epic champion Zargala, who's actually really good at wave clearing. Plus, if you use the code Supreme6, you can get Supreme Gallic, who is Zargala's partner in lore. Also, there's some other codes you can put in instead. Personally, out of all these codes, I'd recommend Alice, since she's useful in pretty much everything, but Sun Wukong and Loki are gods in PvP. So if that's your focus, either of those will serve you well. Just make sure you use my download link or a QR code. If you go through the App Store, you won't get any of these rewards, and they only show up 48 hours after you install. And for both new and existing players, you can use one more promo code, Gameleap, for even more goodies. Though save this one for later, as you can only do one promo code every 24 hours. Raid is also giving everyone the new legendary champion Ludex Artor as part of the 25-day reward calendar, plus a community-voted legendary relic. Huge quality of life updates like background battles, and all you do is download through my link or QR code to get started. And at number 9, we have Korag, the big blue ogre from Highmaul, the first raid of Warlords of Draenor. And if you're struggling to remember who this guy is, well, you're not alone. Korag is one of the bosses that, on paper, should have been memorable. He had a unique visual design, some interesting mechanics, and was part of the raid that introduced us to the Goryeo Empire, a powerful civilization of ogres. So, who was Korag? Korag was one of the strongest warriors in Highmaul, a city ruled by the last remnants of the once great Goryeo Empire. Unlike most ogres, Korag was granted powerful magic resistance after bathing in an ancient rune pool, making him nearly impervious to spells. This led to his entire identity revolving around absorbing magic and using it against his enemies. Which sounds cool, right? But here's the thing. Korag wasn't actually important to the story at all. He wasn't a major warlord or significant figure in World of the Draenor's narrative. He was just some guy who happened to be really good at tanking spells. And in a raid where you're fighting the literal king of the ogres, Emperor Margok, who is a legendary spellcaster, Korag feels like a mid-tier roadblock on the way to the real fight. Alright, let's talk about the fight itself, because this is where Korag had the potential to be cool. The big gimmick of the fight was his shield nullification barrier. It made him immune to magic damage, and every so often, he'd have to leave the fight to recharge the shield, meaning you had your raid focus on ads while you waited for him to come back. The idea was the players had to send volunteers into a rune pool during the fight, where they'd gain a special buff that allowed them to break through his shield. Once enough people were buffed, the raid could actually damage Korag before he recharged again. Now, that sounds interesting in theory, but in practice, it was just a pacing issue. If your raid had poor coordination, you'd just spend most of the fight waiting around while Korag kept refreshing his barrier. If your damage was too low, you'd end up dealing with wave after wave of ads while he continued his magic absorbing nonsense. Nothing about the fight really felt that exciting. There were some orbs to dodge, some ads to kill, and some magic soaking to do. But there was never a moment that felt truly epic or dangerous, especially in a raid that was already on the easier side. So why does no one remember Korag? Simple, he was just completely overshadowed by the rest of Highmaul. The raid started with Korag Bladefist, one of the most famous orc warlords in Warcraft history, who had the most loved Lords of War mini-episode before launch. It had the Butcher, a brutal gladiator fight that people remembered for being a DPS check nightmare. And it ended with Emperor Margok, the actual ruler of High Mountain and a pretty cool final boss, memorable for being really, really long. Korag, he was just kind of there. He wasn't a major lore character, he didn't drop any super iconic loot, and his fight, while unique, just wasn't all that fun. Another reason he's forgotten is that Highmaul itself wasn't a very popular raid. It was the first raid of WoD, so most players outgrew it pretty fast once Blackrock Foundry came out. And the ogre aesthetic didn't really capture people's imagination in the same way the other zones like Blackrock Foundry or Hellfire Citadel did. So if the expansion is forgettable and the raid is forgettable, then of course its mid-tier boss is going to be forgotten too. And at number 8, we have Tortos, a giant turtle boss from Throne of Thunder, the big raid from Mist of Pandaria. Now, if you're scratching your head trying to remember who this guy is, you're not alone. Tortos is one of those fights that players either completely forgot about, or only remembered for one thing, kicking turtles. The most memorable part of this boss fight wasn't Tortos himself, it was the fact that Blizzard literally made players punt turtles across the arena. But before we get into that, let's talk about who Tortos actually was and why he earns a spot on this list. Tortos was a massive ancient turtle that had been feeding off the dark energies of the Throne of Thunder for centuries. According to the lore, the Mogu built the fortress ages ago, and during that time, Tortos just kind of grew there. He absorbed the power of the Thunder King's domain and eventually mutated into a hulking armored monstrosity. But here's the thing, he wasn't actually important to the raid's story overall. He wasn't a servant of the Thunder King, he wasn't a Mogu experiment gone wrong, he was just there, chilling in a cave, until we showed up and ruined his day. If you remove Tortos from the raid entirely, the story wouldn't change one bit. And if we look at the rest of the Throne of Thunder bosses, like Lei Shen, Jinrock, and the Twin Consorts, it's easy to see why no one really talks about Tortos anymore. Now let's get into the fight itself, because this is where Tortos could have been cool, but ended up just being kind of annoying instead. The fight was a classic PvE dodgeball encounter, meaning that the main mechanic was about controlling movement and dealing with constant hazards. Tortos had an ability called Quake Stomp, which stunned the entire raid and caused stalactites to fall from the ceiling. He summoned baby turtles that rolled around the room, knocking players over like bowling pins. He had a giant breath attack that would absolutely destroy your raid if you didn't interrupt it. So how would you stop the breath attack? Well, by kicking turtles into him, of course. Throughout the fight, small turtles would spawn that players could attack. Once they were low on health, you could punt them across the room, knocking them into Tortos and interrupting his deadly breath attack. This was the single most memorable part of the fight, because if you didn't time your turtle kick correctly, the whole raid would wipe. While that might sound fun, in practice, it turned into an absolute nightmare. If the turtles weren't positioned correctly, that means a wipe. If the designator kicker missed their shot, wipe. If the ads overwhelmed your group, another wipe. Basically, Tortos wasn't hard, but he was frustrating. It was one of those fights where one small mistake could cause a full party collapse, making it more annoying than it really needed to be. So, why does no one talk about Tortos? Well, there are a few reasons. He had a zero story relevance. He was just a big angry turtle blocking your path with no real connection to the Thunder King or the raid's plot. Throne of Thunder had way more memorable bosses. Lei Shen, the final boss, was one of the best encounters in WoW's history. The Dark Animus fight was a crazy puzzle encounter. Hordon was another massive beast fight, but at least he felt like an actual threat. Compared to them, Tortos felt like an unnecessary side boss that just didn't really matter. And at number 7, we have Argaloth, a boss you probably fought a few times, but almost certainly don't remember. If you played during Cataclysm, you've most likely defeated this guy at least once. But if someone asked you to name all the bosses from that expansion, there's a good chance Argaloth wouldn't even cross your mind. That's because Argaloth was part of Baradin Hold, one of those PvP-focused raid instances that Blizzard loved to throw into expansions back in the day. And while he technically counts as a raid boss, the reality is, he wasn't much more than a glorified loot pinata. So let's talk about why no one remembers Argaloth. Before we talk about the boss himself, let's set the stage. Baradin Hold was Cataclysm's version of Vault of Archivon from the Wrath of the Lich King. It was a PvP-controlled raid instance, meaning that your faction had to win control of Tol Barad, a large PvP zone, before you could even enter the raid. Every few hours, a massive battle would break out between the Horde and the Alliance for control of the zone. If your faction won, you got access to the raid until the next battle. So naturally, everyone rushed inside to fight Argaloth and grab some easy loot. Sounds exciting, right? Well, not really, because once you got inside, you realized that Argaloth was one of the most basic bosses ever. So what made Argaloth so forgettable? His fight was just ridiculously simple. He was a giant pit lord, basically a discount brutalis from Sunwell. His main mechanic was a giant cleave that forced the raid to split into two groups on either side of him. Every so often, he'd cast Meteor Slash, a fire-based attack that required players to soak the damage together. And that was pretty much it. That was the whole fight. If you had halfway decent gear and could follow basic instructions, you could kill Argaloth without even trying. There was no positioning challenge, no phase transitions, no real sense of danger, just a basic tank and spank with an occasional AoE. And here's the kicker. He dropped PvP gear. That meant most hardcore raiders didn't even care about him. The only reason people bothered with Argaloth was because he was an easy way to farm honor gear or pick up a few early tier PvE choices. Once you had better gear, you never went back. Basically, Argaloth wasn't a real raid boss, he was just a way to get some quick loot. And at number 6, we have Krosus, the giant bridge-smashing demon from the Nighthold in Legion. If you raided during Legion, you've definitely fought this guy. But do you actually remember anything about him? Probably not. And that's kind of surprising because Krosus was one of the more visually impressive fights in the raid. He was a massive, towering Doom Lord who fought players on a crumbling bridge, blasting them with fire and obliterating anyone who wasn't paying attention. Yet, despite all that, he just kind of faded into obscurity. So let's take a look at why Krosus was both awesome and forgettable at the same time. Krosus was one of the giant pit lords of the Burning Legion, the same type of demon as Brutalis and Manaroth. But unlike them, Krosus didn't even get a proper introduction. He just kinda showed up randomly to kill Tyrion and then dipped. And he didn't even succeed. Tyrion survived long enough to hand off the Ashbringer to the Paladin. Now, the Krosus fight was actually one of the cooler encounters in the Nighthold, at least visually. The entire fight took place on a narrow bridge, and over time, Krosus would slowly destroy the platform piece by piece, forcing players into an increasingly tight space. Here's what made the fight unique. Krosus constantly used a smash attack, hitting anyone in front of him, requiring precise positioning. Every so often, he would obliterate a part of the bridge, reducing the available space for the raid. This added a built-in timer. If you took too long, you would literally run out of room and wipe. Players had to dodge fiery orbs that left damage over time zones, limiting movement even further. Krosus wasn't an overly complex fight, but he was a gear check. If you couldn't burn him down fast enough, you'd simply run out of bridge and die. It was a cool fight, especially on Mythic, where the bridge broke apart faster and players had to deal with even tighter spacing. So if Krosus had all these great elements, why do so few people remember him? Well, he just had no real lore significance. He wasn't a major villain, he was just a big brute sent by the Legion. Once we defeated him, no one ever mentioned him again. He was overshadowed by bigger bosses. The Nighthold had one of the best final bosses in WoW's history, Gul'dan. Even other mid-tier bosses like Star Augur were way more famous and memorable because of the mechanics and lore connections. The fight, while cool, was straightforward. Krosus didn't have phase transitions or complex mechanics. He was just a DPS race with a cool visual gimmick. Once you learned the fight, it became pretty repetitive and kinda boring. Legion had so much going on. The expansion was packed with memorable boss fights like Hyjal, Agrimar, and Argus, and compared to those encounters, Krosus just didn't really stand out. And at number 5, we have Feng the Accursed, a boss from Mogu'shan Vaults, the very first raid of Mists of Pandaria. Now, if you've played during MOP, you've probably ran this raid at some point, but do you actually remember Feng? Probably not. And that's a shame because his fight was pretty cool. So let's take a closer look at why Feng deserves more recognition, but never really got it. Feng was a Mogu spirit, an ancient guardian of the Mogu'shan Vaults who was cursed and driven mad by dark energy. In life, he was one of the most feared warlords of the Mogu Empire, but after his death, his spirit was bound to the Vaults to serve as an eternal protector. Now, to be fair, Feng actually had some really interesting mechanics. He cycled through 3 different elemental phases, each with unique abilities. In phase 1, he would rain fire down on the raid and then force players to dodge flame waves. With phase 2, he would summon floating arcane mines that would explode if a player ran into them. For phase 3, he would drain the energy from the tank and then blast the raid with shadow attacks. On top of that, tanks had a special ability to let them absorb one of Feng's powers and use it against him, adding a layer of strategy to the fight. It was actually a really fun boss fight. So why did we forget about him? Well, Mogu'shan Vaults itself just wasn't that memorable. It was just the intro raid for Mists of Pandaria, so most players moved on quickly. He wasn't really tied to any major Pandaria storylines. Elegon, Will of the Emperor, and even the Spirit Kings were way more memorable. So while Feng was a fun fight, he's one of those bosses that people forget even existed. And at number 4, we have Kaz'rogal, a demon boss from the Battle for Mount Hyjal, a raid from the Burning Crusade expansion. If you played during the Burning Crusade, you might remember this raid as the one with way too much trash, where you had to fight wave after wave of enemies before you could even face a boss. And that's exactly why Kaz'rogal is so forgettable. He wasn't the star of the raid, he was just one of the 5 mid-tier demon bosses thrown as a roadblock on the way to Argamon. But despite his lack of story relevance, Kaz'rogal did have one thing going for him, one of the most annoying mechanics of the entire expansion. Kaz'rogal was a high-ranking Doomguard commander of the Burning Legion sent to the invasion of Mount Hyjal. Lore-wise, he was a lieutenant under Argamon, the final boss of the raid and one of the biggest villains in Warcraft's history. But unlike Argamon, who had a deep history dating back to Warcraft 3, Kaz'rogal was basically just a random demon thrown into the raid to fill space. If you played the Battle for Mount Hyjal, you probably don't remember Kaz'rogal for his personality. You remember him for his mana drain. Kaz'rogal had one major mechanic that made him infamous. He constantly drained the mana of every caster in the raid. If a player's mana dropped to 0, they would explode, dealing massive damage to everyone around them. If you were a healer or a DPS caster, this fight was basically a race against time. You had to manage your mana more carefully and hope your group could burn down the boss before he drained everyone dry. If your healers ran out of mana, that was a wipe. Too many casters explode? A wipe. You weren't prepared? A wipe. The only way to beat Kaz'rogal was to bring a mana-efficient raid composition or have tons of mana potions ready to go. Otherwise, you were in for a frustrating time. So why does no one talk about Kaz'rogal? Well, the battle for Mount Hyjal was really repetitive. The raid forced players to clear waves of trash before every boss, which made progression slow and tedious. Many guilds dreaded this raid because of how time-consuming it was. Unlike Archimonde or even Anatheron, who at least had some lore relevance, Kaz'rogal was just a random Doomguard. His fight was frustrating and not really fun. Instead of having engaging mechanics, Kaz'rogal's main challenge was punishing mana users in the most unfair way possible. While fights like Kel'Thas or Vashj required strategy, Kaz'rogal was just a DPS race with the harsh mana attacks. TBC had way more iconic bosses. Black Temple had Illidan Stormrage, Sunwell Plateau had Kil'jaeden, Mount Hyjal had Archimonde, but the bosses before him? Not so much. Kaz'rogal just didn't have the impact of these major encounters. He was forgettable because he never felt important. At the end of the day, Kaz'rogal was just a filler boss in a filler raid. He had no lore, no unique personality, and the only thing people remember about him was just how much he drained their mana. And at number 3, we have Fel Lord Zakuun, one of the lesser known bosses from Hellfire Citadel, the final raid of Warlords of Draenor. Now, if you played Dir WoD, you might remember Hellfire Citadel as the raid that just wouldn't go away. Players were stuck in that place for over a year. But even with all that time spent there, Fel Lord Zakuun is one of those bosses that just completely faded from memory. So let's talk about why he was so forgettable, despite being a pretty good looking boss. Fel Lord Zakuun was a massive armored demon warrior infused with Fel energy, serving as one of Gul'dan's enforcers within Hellfire Citadel. His entire thing was brute strength. He wasn't a spellcaster, he wasn't a master tactician, he was just a massive, rage-fueled demon smashing everything in his path. Sounds cool, right? The problem was, he had absolutely no impact on the story. There was nothing particularly unique or threatening about him compared to the dozens of other Fell-themed bosses in WoD. And when you're in a raid fighting against Kilrogg, Manaroth, and Archimonde, a random demon warrior doesn't exactly stand out. So, what about the fight itself? Surely he must have had some cool mechanics, right? Well, yes and no. Fel Lord Zakuun had a few mechanics that made him unique, but overall the fight was pretty straightforward. His big gimmick was a giant two-handed axe attack that dealt insane damage if the tank didn't properly manage his debuffs. He also had an unstable Fel energy phase, where players had to carefully avoid standing in certain areas or risk getting hit with a massive AoE. In Mythic, he had a possession mechanic where players would be taken over by Fel energy and had to manage their corruption or else explode. Sounds cool on paper, but in really it was just a generic melee boss fight with some green fire thrown in. The fight boiled down to positioning, soaking some mechanics, and making sure you didn't stand in the wrong spot, which isn't exactly exciting. Unlike Archimonde, who was the major Warcraft villain, or even Manaroth, who had history with the orcs, Zakuun was just a big Fel warrior with nothing interesting going on. Many players were burnt out by the time Hellfire Citadel rolled around, and since we were stuck with this raid for over a year, people just wanted to get through it as fast as possible. Because of this, Fel Lord Zakuun ended up being just another forgettable demon boss in a raid that had way more interesting encounters. And at number 2, we have the Conclave of the Chosen, one of the mid-tier bosses in Battle for Dazar'alor, a raid from Battle for Azeroth. Now, if you played during BFA, you probably remember this raid for some of the big cinematic encounters, fighting Jaina Proudmoore, battling King Rostakon, or dealing with the infamous Opulence treasure room. But do you remember Conclave of the Chosen? Exactly. And that's the problem. This fight had potential, but in the grand scheme of things, it was just another forgettable mid-tier raid council fight that felt like it didn't belong in the story. Let's talk about why this boss deserves a number 2 spot on this list of forgotten encounters. The Conclave of the Chosen was a council of 4 powerful Zandalari priests, each representing a different Loa, the spiritual animal gods of Zandalar. In theory, this should have been a really cool fight. After all, the Loa were a huge part of the Zandalari culture, and the idea of battling their chosen champions sounds awesome. But the problem? None of these bosses actually felt important. They weren't major lore figures, they weren't well-developed characters, and worst of all, they weren't even the actual Loa. Instead, they were just stand-ins. Random Zandalari warriors with Loa-themed abilities. And because they weren't the real Loa, the fight felt disconnected from the actual story of the raid. Imagine instead how much cooler it would have been if we actually got to fight Bomsandi, Gonk, or Paku. But no, we just fought their representatives, which made the encounter feel way less exciting than it could have been. Now, from a gameplay perspective, the Conclave of the Chosen fight had some interesting mechanics, but it also suffered from a problem that plagues a lot of council fights. It just felt like a repetitive ad fight. Here's how the encounter works. You face 2 of the 4 bosses at a time, and when one of them died, another one would join in. Each boss had a unique ability that was tied to the Loa, such as Paku's Wrath, giant tornadoes that players had to dodge, Gonk's Wrath, a raptor ad that would jump between targets, Kimball's Wrath, stacking bleed effects that tanks had to manage, Akunda's Wrath, a mind control effect that had to be interrupted. Every time a boss died, the remaining bosses would get stronger, making the fight harder as it went on. On paper, this was a decent fight with some movement and positioning challenges, but in practice, it just felt really repetitive. Just dodging mechanics and dealing with waves of ads until all 4 mini-bosses were dead. Nothing about it really felt epic, and because these characters weren't even real Loa, the fight didn't feel really important to the story either. And finally, at number 1, we have Halion, the final boss of the Ruby Sanctum, an extra raid added at the end of Wrath of the Lich King. If you don't remember Halion, well, you're not alone. Despite being the final raid boss of one of WoW's greatest expansions, Halion is one of the most forgotten bosses in the game's history. So how did Blizzard manage to create an endgame raid boss that almost no one talks about? Well, let's find out. Halion was a Twilight Dragon, a servant to Deathwing who was sent to invade the Ruby Sanctum, one of the sacred dragon shrines of the Red Dragonflight. Now on paper, this sounds like a great setup. The Twilight Dragons were a huge part of Deathwing's army in Cataclysm, and this raid was meant to serve as a story bridge between Wrath of the Lich King and Cataclysm. But the problem? It didn't feel like a real ending to an expansion. Wrath of the Lich King already had reached its epic climax with the fall of Arthas and Icecrown Citadel. Players had spent months battling the Scourge, culminating in one of the most legendary boss fights in WoW's history, the Lich King himself. And then suddenly, Blizzard dropped a filler raid with a random purple dragon, and players just didn't care. Even though Halion's lore was forgettable, his fight was actually pretty interesting. The boss had 3 different phases. Physical Realm phase, where Halion would fight players in the normal world using fire-based abilities. Twilight Realm phase, where at 75% health, you would drag a part of the raid into the Twilight Realm, forcing players to manage 2 battlefields at once. Both realms combined, which in the final phase, the raid had to split into 2 groups, one in each realm while carefully managing Halion's attacks. The mechanics of fighting in 2 realms at the same time was a neat idea, and it was later refined for other fights. The big issue? It was just one boss. Unlike other final raids, the Ruby Sanctum had no extra bosses or build-up. It was literally just Halion. The fight was challenging, but because there was no real reward or excitement, most players just didn't bother running it. So why is Halion the most forgotten raid boss of all time? Well, it was just a filler raid. The actual final boss of Wrath of the Lich King was the Lich King in Icecrown Citadel. By the time Ruby Sanctum came out, most players had already beaten ICC and moved on. Halion felt like an afterthought, not a true final boss. The rewards weren't great. The loot from Halion wasn't much better than ICC gear, so there was no real reason to farm it. Unlike Sunwell Plateau, which had a legendary weapon and powerful gear, Ruby Sanctum didn't offer anything special. It was completely overshadowed by Icecrown Citadel. ICC was one of the most iconic raids in WoW's history. The Lich King fight was one of the most cinematic and lore-heavy fights Blizzard has ever made. Compared to that, Ruby Sanctum just felt unnecessary. It had no lasting impact on the story. The fight was supposed to set up Cataclysm, but didn't actually affect anything. You could skip Halion completely and you wouldn't miss any important lore. Deathwing's story continued in Cataclysm, and Halion was never mentioned again. At the end of the day, Halion wasn't a bad boss. He was just completely forgettable. He was thrown into Wrath of the Lich King after its true ending had already happened, and because of that, nobody really cared. So, congratulations Halion, you are officially the most forgotten raid boss in World of Warcraft. So again, if you want to join me in raid, please look for me in-game under the name The Dual Logs and join my clan, Heroes Cool Squad.